Hey everybody, this is Josh Mall here, and welcome to another exciting Blender Cookie tutorial. In this video, we're going to be looking at some of the techniques that went into the creation of this image right here, focusing specifically on some creative material setups for the goldfish and the bubble, and some interesting lighting techniques. So with that, let's go ahead and jump right in and get started. Alright, so we're going to start with a brand new Blender scene. Go ahead and delete whatever default object you have. I'm going to delete this lamp as well for right now. And I'm going to remove this here. Okay. Before I get too far, let me turn on the screencast keys. Fantastic. That way down in this little lower left-hand corner, you can see what I'm doing, which is going to be helpful because this is not really going to be a modeling tutorial. So as far as modeling the goldfish, I'm going to go through it rather quickly just to save some time. So if you need to, you can see a lot of the commands I'm using over here. I'll try to do my best to narrate what I'm doing, but again, this tutorial is mainly focused on the materials and textures. So with that said, let's make a goldfish in record time. Alright. So I'm going to start by hitting Shift-A, adding in a cube, and hitting Control-2 to add a subsurf modifier, and then hitting Apply. So I now end up with a cube sphere thing. Alright. I'm going to hit O to turn on proportional editing, Z to toggle wireframe, and then I'm just going to start shaping this guy out a little bit into kind of the shape that I want. I want kind of a chubby little fish. You know, a nice big gut kind of a thing. Something like that. Okay. And, yeah. Let's go down to face select mode. I'm going to select these four back faces here. Number one to go back to front view. Turn off proportional editing so I can extrude this out, scale it. Just kind of pull this out, something like that. Just a little stubby little tail section there. Let's see. In fact, I'll go ahead and make the tail. Alright, just hitting E to extrude these out, S to scale them up, just kind of create that, the basic starting point for the tail. I'll hit C to bring up that brush select tool. Then just start, you know, pushing and pulling these vertices to kind of get the shape that I want. And at this point, I'm not going to be worrying about the other side of the fish here because I'm going to be applying a mirror modifier in just moments. So I'll wait. I'm not going to worry too much about how that looks. And let's go grab these guys along the y-axis. Same thing with these, hitting G to grab and then Y to lock it to the y-axis. Something like that. Okay, let's go ahead and throw that mirror modifier on. So I'm going to hit 3 on the number pad to go to side view mode. B to bring up the box select those. X to delete. Put on my mirror modifier, and I want to mirror along the y-axis, not the x-axis. Turn clipping on. I'll select this whole edge loop here. Move it, just make sure it's locked there. Okay. And so now we'll just go back to, you know, grabbing some vertices, moving them around. At this point, you know, basically all I'm doing is shaping it until I get it the way that I like it. You know, we're not working from a specific reference image, so we're not looking to match this to any particular, you know, piece of concept art or any such thing. So, you know, really, this is up to you. Just play with it. You know, move these around until you get them basically the way you like them. Just move these in here just a little bit. Ooh, that doesn't look very good. Let's pull that sucker in along the y-axis. There we go. Okay, that'll do for right now. For the tail, for his little upper on top of his head fin, whatever fin you would call that, we'll grab these 4, hit E to extrude, scale those down, and then E to extrude again. Scale it down. I'm going to rotate it like so. And again, just, you know, grabbing these vertices, pulling them around until you basically get the shape you want. And again, you know, I'm not going for perfection, just kind of going for some basic shapes. You know, I know essentially what I want the fin to look like. So I'm not worried about getting everything real exact. Doesn't need to be perfect, just, close. Especially for the sake of this, I'm not going to spend too much time with it. Okay, that'll work. For the eye, I'm going to select this vertex right here, delete it, select this whole edge loop, E to extrude, S to scale, and I'm going to use the spherize command to basically round this out by hitting Alt Shift S. Then you can see as I drag this around, it makes it more or less round. We want it to be all the way round, so I'm just going to type 1, hit enter, and makes that perfectly round there. Just kind of a quick little shortcut to rounding out things that are not round. Alright, now I'll go ahead and select this. E to extrude, scale it down, and bring it in. This will be the basis of our eye socket. We get this little fin out of the way down here. Actually, okay, yeah, we're going to put it over here. So we'll just hit E to extrude, S to scale that guy down, and once again, just start pulling things, shaping them the way we want. We'll hit E to extrude one more time. And in this one, I'm going to hit S to scale, and then I'm going to hit Shift X, which will basically, if you hit scale and then you hit X, it will lock it to the X-axis and only scale in that direction. If you hit scale or grab or rotate or whatever, and then Shift X or Y or Z, it will scale it in every axis except that one. So by hitting scale and then Shift X, we scaled it along the X or the Y axis and the Z axis, but not along the X axis. Hope that made some sense. All right, let me see. I'm gonna adjust a little bit of his fin up here. I want to thin this out right along his spine, I guess. Thin out the top so it kind of tapers off. Select those, rotate them just a little bit, grab them along the y-axis. Alright, that's looking good. For the mouth, I'm going to delete this vertex right there to give him this big hole in his head. Select these, E to extrude, and then I'm going to hit S and then Shift Y so that it scales, but it does not scale along the y-axis. Then I can scale it along the y-axis myself to get it just how I want it. He's got some big old cheeks there. I actually kind of like that. I might leave those big cheeks like that. It's kind of neat. Yeah, maybe we'll see. Maybe I'll grab this and pull it forward a little bit and scale it up just a little bit to give room for some lips. All right, well, let's shape his mouth here a little bit better. We can grab some of these. Let's give him a little smile. Select that, E to extrude, S to scale, go something like this. Control R to bring in a big edge loop, pull that forward a little bit for some lips. Select these. As you can see, there's not a lot of real science to it. It's just kind of figuring out, playing with it until I get something that I think looks pretty good. And, okay. Let's work on this eye socket a little bit. I'm going to put another edge loop in here and pull it out a little bit. Scale this one down. I'm going to pull these ones out a little bit as well to give them a little bit of a brow. I don't really know if fish have brows, so to speak, but this one does. And we'll spread these out. Alright, that's looking good. I'm going to go ahead and move it up above this grid floor as well by hitting G, Z. There we go, just so it's kind of out of that. We can see a little better what we're doing. Alright, and let's see what this guy looks like smoothed out. I'm going to select him, hit Control 2, and that looks pretty good. I like that. We'll go ahead and add a smooth shader on there as well. And let's clean up a few little deals. He's got a little weird little lump going on in his cheek here. Something like that. Okay, that looks good. And for the eyes are real simple. Let's Shift A, add in a UV sphere. We don't need quite that much geometry, so let's go 16 segments, 8 rings. We can scale this guy down. Bring it up here. And something like that work out pretty good. I'm going to scale this one down a little bit. Bring these out and scale it down as well. And just kind of center this eyeball in that pocket. And now to get this eyeball mirrored, a technique that I use all the time is I'll select the eye, shift select the fish, and hit Control J to join them. And you'll see that it automatically applies these modifiers to it as well because they are now one object. We can hit Tab to go into edit mode, deselect everything, and then hovering over the eye and hitting L, we can select just the eye. Hit P and we'll separate it by selection. So now they are two separate objects, but the eye contains the mirror modifier and the subdivision surface modifier that we added to the fish. Alright, that's going to be good. We'll call that good for now. I'm going to go ahead and save this. Alright, and I should probably take you through the method of modeling the bubble that we're going to be doing as well. Again, I apologize if this goes fast. If you need to rewind and watch it a couple times to get it all, that's fine, but here we go. I'm going to hit Shift A, add in a UV sphere, scale it up, move it up along the Z-axis. That was rough, guys. Alright, I hope you caught all that. If not, like I said, you can rewind and figure it out. Okay, so that's basically it for the modeling. Let's see, maybe we'll center this a little bit more, scale it up. Okay, and we'll go ahead and add a subdivision surface modifier there and a smooth shader, and that will be fine. The only thing I want to do, just for the sake of doing it, is go into edit mode on the bubble. We'll grab this bottom vertice, hit O to toggle the proportional editing, and we'll just grab and move it up along the Z-axis, increasing this fall off here, because we want to make this look like it's sitting on a table. And so adding a little bit of a little lump to it like this will make it look like it's sitting on something, like it's a water drop sitting on a table of some sort. And we'll just go ahead and select it all and move it up along the Z-axis so it's right along that there. And we'll go ahead and hit Shift A, bring up add in a new plane, scale this out. Okay. And this is basically our scene. We'll go ahead, select this, jump into side view with number pad 3, Shift D to duplicate it, right click to leave it where it's at, R to rotate, and we'll just type in 90, hit enter, and we'll just line this up over here, and we'll scale it along the Z-axis just a little bit. Alright, so there we have our scene is modeled. Okay. Now for the fun parts. We're going to get into setting up some, doing some interesting things with the material shaders that you may not have done before, and then I'm going to show you a few little tricks when it comes to lighting something like this. So yeah, let's get started. First thing I'm going to do, I'm going to hide this, and we're just going to worry about the goldfish for right now. If I can keep him in the view here. There we go. Alright. So, with this goldfish, we're actually going to be doing some texture painting on this guy, which is a really cool feature if you've never done it. It basically allows you to paint a texture directly on the 3D model, and it's really neat. It's something I don't do nearly enough, but it's cool. So, we're going to jump right in and do that. So, first off, before I get any farther, I want to set my render engine up here to the Cycles render engine, if it's not already. And we're going to go ahead and give this guy a new material by just going to our Materials tab, hitting New, and we will just call this Goldfish. Alright. And I'm going to split my view as well and change this into a UV image editor, because we're going to be creating a new texture in here and then painting it on the actual model. So to do that, first thing I want to do, because I discovered earlier today that if I don't do this step, I get some really weird results, is back in our Modifiers tab. Now that we have our fish modeled, I'm going to apply the mirror modifier. And the reason I do that is I found that when painting, doing the texture painting with a mirror modifier intact, it didn't work very well. So consider yourself lucky that I had that problem, because now you won't have to. Alright, so with that done, we'll hit Tab to go back into edit mode, and we need to split the UVs on this guy. For this particular character, it's going to be real simple. We're going to select this middle edge loop going all the way down the middle. Hit Control E and mark seam. And then we're basically just going to cut his little dorsal fin. Is that the dorsal fin? If anybody knows, go ahead and tell me in the comments, because I have no idea which fin is the dorsal fin. Maybe this one. If it is, we're going to select this edge loop right around here. Actually, let me hide these. Or actually, I'm going to select the floor and the wall there. I'm going to hit M and move those to layer 2, just so they're out of my way. Alright, back into edit mode. So with this edge loop here selected, we'll hit Control E, mark seam. And then I also want to cut out, I'm going to go into edge select mode so it's just a little easier to select. I'm going to select the edges, kind of cutting out the section here, just like that. Hitting Control E, mark seam. And now if we hit, oh, I guess I have to do this on both sides here. Last time I did this I had the mirror modifier, so I didn't actually have to do it on this side. So we'll go to the other side, do the same thing. Hit that middle one there, Control E, and then we'll cut out these ones right here on the back so we don't see it. Oh, see? Select this one here. There we go. Something like that. Control E, mark seam. And now, if we select all, hit select all. Wow, what did I do? How do you like that, guys? Interesting. Alright, now if we select all, hit U and unwrap. Here we have our fish. And it looks, yeah, it looks okay. One thing I do want to do is line these up a little better. I'm going to select all of these here by hovering over them, hitting L, and then hitting Shift L while hovering over the additional pieces to select those. I'm going to grab those. Oh, I think my proportional editing is still on. I'm going to grab those and just move them over here. There we go. And I want to take these, so I'll just hover over here, hit L, and I want to line them up pretty close to the same. I'm not on top of each other, but I want them to be basically facing the same direction and to fill up the space here as much as possible. So I'll select them, hit S to scale, and that's going to be a bit much. Something like that. And I want to keep them facing this direction because when I add the scale texture in later, actually, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to select this one. I want to flip this one around, actually, because my scales are all going in one direction, and when I apply it, I want it to apply correctly. So I'm going to select this one, going to hit Scale, and X, so that it scales like this, and I'm going to type -1, and that will basically just mirror it just like that. Okay. And they look about pretty close to the same size. Maybe I can scale this one up just a little bit. And you want to make sure to keep the UVs all inside of this little grid here because that's going to be the boundaries of the texture. Okay, so that is in place. So let's create our texture. We'll go down here to the little image panel here, and we'll hit New. We're going to name this one Goldfish Color, and we'll set it to a good 2048 by 2048, just so it's nice and big. And for the color, we're going to pick a kind of what we want the base color for the goldfish to be. We're going to be painting in some colors that are lighter and a few areas that are darker. So we want a good basic, a good starting color. And I kind of like that, maybe a little bit, something like this. That looks good for now. Okay. So I'll hit OK. And there you see we have this texture here. Now one thing that's very important when doing the textures like this is this little star right here on this image button, because if that star is there, that means that this image is not saved and it will not actually affect what's going on over here. So if we make a bunch of changes, do a bunch of painting, but we don't save it here, then it doesn't actually apply it over here. So what we'll do, we'll click here, we'll go save as image, and you can just you can save this wherever you want, name it whatever you want, so long as you can remember where you put it and what you called it. For me, I'm going to call it Goldfish Diffuse, and go ahead and just hit save as image, and there you see our little star is gone, meaning that the image is now saved. Alright, so with that done, we can go back to our materials panel here, And under the diffuse here, under the color, we'll click this little tab and we'll select image texture. And if we click this, it'll browse all the image textures that we currently have loaded into the scene, which we only have the one, goldfish color, so we'll select that. And we'll use vector default. Default is actually using the UVs, so we don't have to mess with the vector at all. It should all be good. And so now, if we switch our viewport shading to textured, you can see we now have something that looks like a nice little chubby goldfish cracker. All right, so we're making good strides here. Okay, so let's do some painting. If you've never used texture painting before, it's a really great way to kind of organically texture a model. And to do that, we'll just go down here to our little mode menu, and we will select texture paint mode. Not real complicated. Now, this works basically like a painting program. You have your brush here. You can pick any color you want. Shows it right here. You've got your brush settings here, which you can adjust them here, but I find it's easier to be in the 3D viewport. If you hit F, you can scale your brush size up and down, and if you hit Shift F, you can scale the brush strength in and out. So this would be very, very light. All the way in would be very, very intense. We want it to be kind of light. We don't want it to be real strong, and we also don't want it to be pink. We want this to be white for this particular part of the painting. Okay, so with that in place, basically what we're going to do is, you can see we can just paint, and it paints on here, and it also paints it over here on our texture. But for this, I don't want to have to paint both sides of the fish and everything. It can just get a little tedious having to paint this side, then rotating it around, painting the other side. They won't be even, they won't be exactly the same. So to fix that, I'm going to go down here on our brush settings over here, and I'm going to turn off these three options. And what that's going to allow me to do, if I turn my strength up, you can kind of see a little better, is if I paint like this, you can see it duplicates it on the other side. It's basically painting through the model, which these, if I paint over here, you can see it does not. And we want to paint through our model, just to save some time. So I'm going to turn all those off. I'm going to hit Shift F and bring my brush intensity down quite a bit, and hit F to scale the brush up a little bit, not quite that big. And then I'm going to start just painting in the color. As you can see, this looks pretty good. I just kind of want to have him give him like a white belly, and maybe a little bit of a more pale tone on the ends of his fins there, and his tail. Just kind of painting it till you get it how you like it. This is your goldfish, so you do with it what you want. If you want to go back and undo some of that white, the easiest way that I can think of to do it is on your color selector here. Click on this, and then click this little eyedropper tool, and then select just the base color on the image over here. And you can see it'll automatically select that color, and you can go back in and then paint over using that color, just to kind of give it a little bit more of a fade, something like that. That looks pretty good. I like that. And I want to add in a few little bit of darker areas, not a lot, but using this base color, I'm just going to increase it more towards the red a little bit. Oops. And just kind of darken in around his eye a little bit. Again, not a lot. And maybe kind of up here along the top of his head. Just kind of give it a little bit of a darker tone. Maybe right in here. Again, this is all up to you, kind of how you want it. Okay, I think that looks fine. And we can see that it painted on both sides, and it looks pretty good. I like how this looks. Alright, so that texture is good, but we gotta remember, here's our little star here. If we were to render this, which actually I can just show you that right now, render this, you'll notice, well, first off, there's no lights in the scene, so it's kind of bland, but none of this seems to be showing up. And that's because we didn't save the image. And since you didn't save the image, it's still using just the blank orange image that we saved earlier. So we'll go down here to image, we'll save image, and then we'll gotta switch out of the rendered mode and then back into the rendered mode. And now you can see that our texture is now showing up. So okay, so that looks pretty good. Yeah, I like that. Alright, well, while we're in texture paint mode, we're actually going to be painting one more texture as well. So, to do this, I'm going to split my view down here on this little side here, and I'm going to bring up our node editor, because I find it a little bit easier to do some of the more complicated node or material settings with the nodes. So to do this, I want to, first off, create a new image over here. So I'm going to go to Image, New Image, making sure that this one is saved first. New Image. And we're going to call this one Goldfish Mask. And we want to leave it black. Okay? And again, we need to save it because it's not actually saved anywhere. So I'm just going to save it here, same place I saved my Goldfish Diffuse texture. Okay? And before we can see it and paint it and everything, we need to set it up so that it's part of this material. So I'm going to go down here to our material nodes, duplicate this image texture node, and right here I'm going to click on this to scroll down our existing textures and click on Goldfish Mask. And now if we drag this over to our color, we can see, maybe, there we go. I have to select it on the, highlight it on the node here, that it's now using this black texture, which looks awful, but this isn't actually going to be seen color-wise. What this is going to be is we want a few parts of our fish to be kind of transparent. You know, some of the ends of the tail, the ends of the fins a little bit. We want them to be a little bit transparent. And to do that, we're going to create a mask, which is basically a black and white image where the black part represents one material, the white part represents another material. And it's going to allow us to mix the two materials thusly. So we'll select a white color and turn the strength down to a moderate amount, and we'll just kind of start painting where we want this to, where we want it to affect. And we'll have to paint both of these fins independently. If we were to just paint straight through, it would be painting all under the body and everything, and we don't want that. Alright, so with that kind of painted, we'll go back to a black, turn our intensity way down, and we'll just kind of fade these a little bit smoother so it's not quite so abrupt. Okay. And we really want this to only be affecting the extreme, mostly be affecting the extreme parts of these, like the extreme ends of the tail. We don't want it to be affecting anywhere up in here. So we can go ahead and go like this. And then just kind of fade this a little bit, just so it transitions a little bit smoother. So it's not so abrupt. Okay, that'll work. And that's all we need to do for this one. So with that, we'll go back down here to our image. We'll hit Save Image, just so we know that that's all good to go. And with those in place, we are done texture painting. So we can go back to object mode. And I'm going to bump this, actually I'm going to shrink this away. I'm going to shrink this panel down and then extend this up. Open up our node editor down here again. And let's start playing with the materials here. I'm going to set up a couple lights just so we can kind of see how this is going by adding in a plane. Just kind of rotating it around like so. Creating a new material, we'll just set it to emission, maybe 3. And that way if we swap over to rendered mode, it's rendering out like that. Okay, so with that in place, select our fish here. We got our goldfish material node set up here. We're going to do quite a bit with this material. I'll try not to go too fast, but basically what we're going to do is we're going to start with a mix node mixing two different diffuse textures together, or diffuse materials. And I know that sounds a little weird, but I'll show you why in a minute. So first off, we'll take this first one, and it's going to be using our texture that we just painted, using the goldfish color texture. And I'm going to duplicate this diffuse, and this one I want to set to kind of a darkish reddish orange. Alright, we'll hit Shift A to input a shader and then a mix shader. Drop that there. We'll connect this one here. And then instead of just mixing the factor, because right now, if I jump over to rendered, what it's doing is it's mixing these two shaders at 50%. So, you know, it just kind of, right now it's just taking the texture that we painted and making it a little bit more orange. But we don't really want that. What we're going to be doing is in our node editor down here, hitting Shift A, going to input and then layer weight. We'll grab this here, and we're going to be using this facing little point here and connecting that to the factor. And I actually think, yeah, I'm going to want these reversed. We want our color to be on the bottom, like that. And now, if I change this, I'm going to change this to like a blue color so you can see what's happening. First off, that's actually kind of a cool looking effect. But what this is doing is it's using the facing value to determine how these are mixed. So at a point where the object is facing us completely, it's 100% this one. Where it's absolutely not facing us at all, it's 100% the blue. And then it fades, you know, as it gets more. So you can see if we rotate these, you know, where it's facing us is always the orange texture, and where it's not is always this dark blue. Well, we don't want dark blue, even though that is kind of cool looking. We're going to switch this back to kind of a dark orangey red. And basically what that's going to give us is, especially on like these underbelly areas here, you can see it gives us just this kind of this little orange rim, which I just kind of like. Yeah, so that looks good. So that's step one. Step two is we want to set up our translucency on the fins using our mask. So here we have our image texture with the mask texture. Drag this over here. We'll duplicate this mix shader and plug it in right over here. And we're going to add in a new shader, hitting Shift A, and we're going to add in a transparent. We'll plug the transparent in down here. And immediately you can see that again it's just mixing the two, but we don't want it to do that. We're going to use this mask that we painted to basically determine where the transparency shows up. So if we drag this color down to the factor, you can see immediately that the tip of his fin here, right out there, and it's a little hard to tell because there's not a lot behind it, and it's really subtle. And if you wanted to, you could go back in and paint the mask to be more intense or to include more areas. But right now, it's just affecting, you know, these areas right here. They have a little bit of translucency to them, and that's what we want because that looks kind of nice. All right. Well, what's a fish if it's not a little bit shiny, right? So let's go ahead and make it a little bit shiny by adding in yet another mix shader. So we'll grab this, hit Shift D, drag it over here. We'll hit Shift A, add in a glossy shader. And we'll plug that one in. And it looks a little bit washed out, and that's because it's mixing it at a full 50%. We don't want that. We'll set this down to about 0.1. And we'll set the roughness here, which is basically how shiny the object is. We'll set that down to a 0.1 because it's underwater, it's all wet. You know, it's going to have a good little bit of specularity. So that's looking pretty good. That looks pretty nice. I like that. We're going to call that good for the material. Here in a little bit we'll be adding the scale texture in. But as you can see, you know, in not a lot of time we've created this really complicated looking material it just gives us, a much more unique result than if we had just used the texture and thrown a diffuse and a glossy mix. It gives us something a little more interesting. All right, so let's move on to his eye. His eye texture is going to be a little bit different. And before we get into that, I'm going to first hide this light so I can see what I'm doing here. Before we get into that, let's go ahead and select the eye, go into edit mode, reduce this a little bit. I'm going to scale it up just a little bit so it fits in that socket a little better. And with everything selected, I'm going to hit Shift D, right click to leave it where it's at, and then S to scale it way down. And if I go into top view mode, I can kind of see what I'm doing here. I want to put this one close to the edge over here. So it's just inside. This is basically going to be our pupil. And we're going to do it this way to kind of simulate, if you look at a fish eye, it's not just like a solid color. It's got this weird kind of translucency, glassiness to it that we're going to try to replicate. So with that in place, still in edit mode, I'm going to add in a couple of textures or materials. So over in our materials, I'm going to hit this to add one, this to add one. This first one, we'll hit new and we'll call this eye. The second one, we'll hit new and we'll call this pupil. And with this little smaller sphere selected, we're going to make sure pupil's highlighted and hit assign. That way, this pupil material will be applied to this, the eye material will be applied to this. And we can test this by hitting A to deselect it, and selecting one of these and hitting select. You can see the pupil only selected that one, the eye only selects this one. So we're good to go. So now we can tap out of edit mode. I'm going to hit Alt H, turn that light back on. Oh, there's our bubble. Let's hide that guy again. We'll get to it. Alright, so with the eye, let's jump back into rendered mode just so we can see the changes that we're doing. And the eye is just going to be a mix shader, and is going to be a mix between a glass and, a transparent. And we don't want it to be 50-50. We want it to be mostly glass. So we're going to set the mix to a 0.1. That looks pretty good. And I'm going to change the color of the glass to kind of a greenish yellowish. Not real intense, but just a little bit, because that's kind of the color of a fisheye. And I'm also going to change the index of refraction to like a 1.3. Okay, that looks alright. For the pupil, the pupil is going to be just a plain black diffuse. So that, well, that's a little hard to see. Let's do this a little differently. Let's do a mix shader. We'll do a diffuse with a glossy. And then we'll take this, make it pretty dark. But that way it just gives us this this little hint of like something inside of his eye. It kind of just looks a little bit more fisheye-like. Especially from a distance, it just kind of gives us that weird translucency looking fisheye look. Alright, so that's all we need to do for that. So the eyes are done, the goldfish material is done. Let's work on that scale texture. Now for this one, I'm going to duplicate or split this again, bring up our image editor. For this one, I'm going to create another new, or actually no, I'm not. I forgot. I took the liberty of for this particular tutorial creating a my own fish scale texture, and I'm gonna load that in by clicking on image, open image, and let's see, go to textures. If I remember where I put it all. Okay. So this is the fish scale texture that I created, and it will be available to download with the project files if you are a citizen member. If not, I'll try to include a link up to a site where you can find this texture. That way you don't have to go steal one off of Google, but you can have this one for free. I don't even mind. So with this in place, we will set this up. We'll select our fish. And down here in our materials, we'll take one of these image texture nodes, we'll hit Shift D to duplicate it, bring it over here, and we will change this from the goldfish mask to the scale tile. And we could just drag this up to the displacement, but I really want to have a lot more control over how much of a bump it's giving us. So instead, we'll hit Shift A, go down to Converter, and add in a math node. And if we set this to multiply, what this will do is if we drag one here and one there, this value now determines how much of a bump we have. So basically it's taking this information, multiplying it by this, and then sending that to the displacement. So at the moment it's 0.5, so the bumpiness would be half the bump that it would have been if this math node wasn't here. If we switch this back to rendered, we can see that looks kind of goofy. And it's also a little bit too bumpy for my tastes. I'm going to bump this down to about a 0.1, maybe a 0.2. I want a real subtle bump. There we go. Something like that looks a little bit better, but I don't want this scale all over this guy. So we're going to do a little bit more texture painting. First thing I want to do is I don't want to mess up the bump texture that I have. So I'm going to save a new image that we can then paint on and be good to go. So I'm going to go down to Image, Save As Image. And then you can just save it somewhere, call it Goldfish Scales, or just something to where it'll be unique to this project. I'm going to save that. And now I'm going to jump back into, let's go to a textured mode. We'll select this one here down in the node editor so we can see what we're doing. And I'm going to go back to texture paint. And basically what I'm going to be doing here is selecting a black color and just painting over where I don't want the scales to affect it. You know, and he's not going to have scales on the upper part of his fin there. I don't really want any right in the front or around his eyes or right around his mouth. Yeah, so, and if we turn the intensity way down, we can really kind of fade these scales in. You know, so it's not a real subtle jump all of a sudden. You know, we don't want any on the tail, obviously. So let me turn the intensity back up. We can just get rid of these. Okay. And on these fins here, we can just get rid of those. Make sure to get the other side as well. Okay. I like that a little better. Now if we jump over to rendered, oh, that's right, it's not going to make a difference because we didn't save the image. Always save the image. We'll just hit image, save image. We'll switch out of it and then back into rendered mode. And now you see we just have a few subtle scales on the back here. And yeah, that works good. Just to give it a hint of that scale, you know, it doesn't need to be real intense, but just give it a little hint of it. Okay, I like that. So we can switch back to just regular object mode and close this down. And with that done, let's work on that bubble. I'm going to hit Alt-H to unhide it. And this is basically just going to be a bubble of water. So we can hit New on the materials. We'll call this bubble or water, whatever you want to call it. And this is going to be a mix shader using a glass material and an emission material. And you might be thinking that's a weird combination, but I'll show you what we're going to do with it. I'm going to do something kind of interesting here. Basically, what we're going to do is we're going to do a similar thing we did on the goldfish. I'm going to hit Shift A, go to the input, and go down to the layer weight, and use that facing value as our factor here. So if I switch over to rendered here, you can see kind of what's happening here is out along the edges it's this emission, where along the inside it's this glass, which this is a little bit much. I'm going to put this down to a very small amount, like 0.01, so that it's almost all the glass except for right along this edge. It just gives us a little bit of that, just a hint of glow. And I'm going to do a few things. First off, I want to change the index of refraction value on the glass. which this, if you don't know what this is, this basically determines how much the light is bending as it goes through this object and distorting the stuff that you see behind it. Now, all kinds of different objects, clear, glass, water, plastic, they all have a very different index of refraction. And I just happen to know, because I've researched it a couple times, that water has an index of refraction of 1.333. So we change that. All of a sudden our fish looks a little bit better too, which is nice. But if you ever want to kind of research that and play with it, you can go to Google, type in index of refraction values, and it'll give you a good series of lists that just have different types of materials and the refractions that go along with it. On this glass material, I'm also going to turn the roughness to a 0.01 just to give it the subtlest bit of a softness to it. For the emission shader here, I'm going to change this from a white to kind of a blue, just to help add that illusion of water. And that looks pretty good. Now, the one thing about this particular material is, while it's pretty much done, it's not going to look really cool until we get the lighting set up properly and the background in, because the one thing about refractive materials is they don't really look all that cool unless something is behind them. So this may not look super impressive, but it'll get there. Speaking of which, let's get it there. Alright, so we've got our materials here. I'm going to delete this light because we're going to be doing something different with the lighting. So we've got our fish done, our bubble done. If we go to this layer here, we have our floor and wall. So let's do something with the environment. Now, for the floor, just for the sake of the tutorial, I'm just going to give it just a standard diffuse texture, just kind of a dark-ish black, just for the sake of saving some time. I'm going to set my camera up here. I'm going to hit 1 on the number pad to go into front view mode, Control-Alt-0 to snap my camera to that view, and then just kind of drag the camera around. If I hit G to grab the camera and then click on the middle mouse or the mouse wheel button, I can push and pull the camera. So we'll push it in a little bit. Something like that should work. Make sure. See how that looks. Okay. One thing I do want to do is I'm going to select my fish, and I'm going to rotate him around a little bit, which if you select an object and you hit R and then R again, it gives you kind of this free rotate. So I'm going to kind of just maneuver him around, so just to give him a little bit more character so he's not directly from the side. Something like that will work. It's a little dark, but you get the idea. Okay. So let's set up the environment here. For this back panel, in my picture, I just decided to put him in front of, make him look like he was sitting on a bookshelf or in front of a bookshelf or something like that. So I found a texture on cgtextures.com, which is a website I highly recommend checking out. It's just got tons and tons of free textures. A lot of them are really good. And if you're really needing something specific, like I really needed some books, for an image like this, I didn't really want to take the time to model the books because they were going to be in the background. They were going to be kind of blurry. It's going to be dimly lit. It didn't require a huge amount of detail. So I knew I could get away with just using an image. So I found this image. So with this selected, we're going to create a new material. We'll just call it wall. You can name it books or whatever. And it's just going to be a diffuse material. But we're going to change the color to use an image texture. We'll open up the image, and we'll find the image. It's just called Books 0003. If you just go to CG Textures and search for books, you can find this. But there's a ton of other images there, if you find something you like a little better. So there we go. And I want to split this view here because I want to set the UVs up. So we're going to switch this to a UV image editor, hit tab to go into edit mode, and you can see this is the image here. It's just some old looking books. And with this selected, I'm going to hit U, project from view bounds. And what that will do is make sure you're not at an angle. When we do that, we want to be straight on front view because it's going to project it from the view that we're at. So if we were at a view like this, we hit U, project from view, you can see what it did there. It projected the UVs kind of at this angle, which is not what we want. We want it to be, perfect like this. So we'll hit project from view and then bounds, and that will project it just like this, and it will fit it automatically to the boundaries of this image, which is exactly what we want. Alright, so with that in place, if we go back to our camera mode here, select material, it'll kind of let you see this a little bit better, and then we can move this down so this looks pretty good. We'll scale it maybe along the Z-axis, rotate it a little bit so it looks like these bugs are kind of sitting right on the edge there. Okay, that'll work. If we render that out, okay, that'll work out fine. Alright, so I'm going to minimize this again. For the lighting, I'm going to be using an HDRI image, or HDR image. The I might actually stand for image. We're going to be using an HDR image to set up some very realistic reflections and whatnot, especially when you have things like, like this glass texture or some, like a really glossy texture. This is a great way to give it some very realistic looking reflections. Unfortunately, the HDR image that I'm going to be using is not from CG Textures, and I don't have the permission to distribute it with this project. There are several resources out there that offer some free HDRI images or HDR images, and I encourage you to check those out. But this I will at least show you how it's done, in case you've never used those before. So to do that, we'll go to our World tab, and we'll make sure that we're using nodes on this. And under the color, we're going to switch it to an environment texture rather than an image texture. We'll hit open. I'll just go find the image that I'm using. And again, I can't distribute this one, but a quick Google search of free HDRI images or HDR images will take you to it'll find you a couple sites that have some free ones available, and there's a lot of sites out there that have some very high quality images that you can pay for, which if you're working on a pretty significant project, I would recommend, because there's some pretty good images out there. Anyway, so basically what this does is, rather than using just a solid color as the environment, it now, if I jump back into rendered mode here, you can kind of see that it's created this entire environment around the world, and if we wait for a few seconds here to let this load, we get some very natural looking and realistic looking reflections. The only downside is that this is our primary light source at the moment, but our goldfish is not lit up enough. Now we could, put a big image plane or a big plane here with an emission texture and just shine it down, but that's going to throw a bunch of big ugly highlights on our bubble, which is not something we want. And so I was debating, kind of wrestling with this little hindrance, and I have to give credit to a cousin of mine who said something absolutely brilliant. He said, why not just put the light inside the bubble? And that's exactly what we're going to be doing. So, but it's going to take a little bit of tweaking. It took me a few tries to get this right. But basically, if we hit Shift A to add a plane, kind of bring it up. We don't want it to be real big because we want it to be completely inside this bubble. We'll kind of put it, something like this. Hit Z, make sure there's nothing sticking out anywhere. Okay. Now for this, we will set it up. We'll just we'll call this light. That'll work. We'll change it to an emission. Maybe set it up to 2. We'll see if we need to adjust it. But we need to do a few things, because if we set this to render right now, first off, it's obvious that it's there because we can see it. Well, if we go to our object panel here, all the way down at the bottom, we have this ray visibility option. And we can turn this off to the camera, which will make it to where it will still affect things in the scene, but it will not be visible to the camera. So we'll just turn that off. Well, it looks like it's still there. Well, if I select the bubble here and I hide it, you can see that the light is actually not there. But for some reason, if the bubble's here, it still shows up. And that's because the light is still transmitting through the bubble. So what we need to do is we need to also turn off this transmission. And what that does is it's now no longer transferring through this glass texture. So it's affecting the fish inside the bubble, but it's not affecting the bubble itself, which allows us to then, we can turn this up to maybe 3.5 to really adjust this how we want it, to get our fish nice and bright without throwing a bunch of ugly reflections all over the bubble, but still getting some nice reflections on the fish himself. And I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to hit Shift-A to bring up another plane. I'm going to put it down here just to kind of be a little bit of a rim light. Just a little bit to kind of catch some of this unders and also get some of that scale bump texture a little bit. So we'll go and create a new texture. We'll call this rim light. I'm going to set this to a slightly bluish color and set this to, set it to animation. And now let's take a look here. You can see we have the same problem, so we'll go to our Object tab, turn off the camera, turn off transmission, and there we go. So that's looking pretty good. I do want to adjust a few things. First off, the world settings. I'm going to turn the strength of this texture down because I really want it to be much more dimly lit with the fish really standing out. So let's try putting this down to about a 0.5. And there, I like that a lot better. We still get the nice reflections on the bubble itself. It looks very natural, but the fish really stands out as being much more brightly lit. And that looks pretty good. The only other thing I want to do before we call this finished is I'm going to hit 3 to jump into side view, select our camera, go to our camera object properties here, and I'm going to add a little depth of field. So the first thing I want to do is I want to turn on limits so we can see what we're doing. And down in the depth of field, down in the bottom right here, just kind of move this over, and we've got this little yellow crosshair, and that's basically where the focal point of the image is going to be, and then it's going to get blurrier the farther away it gets in either direction. So we want to put that right about on the face of the fish, just like that, so that the farther back it gets, the blurrier it gets, the farther closer, so that'll be pretty good. And then let's adjust this radius here. We'll jump back to our camera view, go into rendered mode, and that way we can kind of preview how the depth of field is looking. If we turn this up to let's say a 0.1, we can see, okay, looks alright. It's not very blurry. I want the background to be a little blurrier than that. So maybe let's turn that up to a 0.2. See what kind of look we get there. There we go. That's looking pretty good. I'm going to turn up the color on this floor a little bit, just so it's not quite so dark. Something like that will be alright. Okay. Alright. Now, the one thing with using a glass texture or a glass material like this is it's going to require a lot more samples to render out clean. It's just one of the unfortunate things about using those, but they do produce a lot of noise just inherently. So, on the render settings, when you get all this finished and you're ready to render it out, down here under the sampling, you have your samples here. For an image, a normal image I can use between maybe 150 and 400, depending on the lighting setup and some of the other factors. But for something that includes a material like this, to get a really clean one, you're looking at probably closer between 500 and 800, maybe even more, depending on how complicated the glass is and how many lights are shining through it and all that other kind of stuff, to get a really clean, noise-free image. So for this, I'm going to go ahead and set it up to 500. and we will render this guy out. I'm not going to make you sit here while we render it. I will be back with you when it's done. So yeah, I will see you guys when it's finished. Okay, and here is our finished image. And you can see even at a full 500 samples, it's still got a little bit of noise inside the bubble area, and that's just one of the downsides with using the glass material. Is it just takes a lot of samples to get a good clean render. So maybe set this thing up overnight, go to bed, wake up, and you'll have a great looking goldfish. Well, we're going to call this finished for the tutorial. I hope you guys had a lot of fun, but more than that, I really hope you learned some new techniques on how to mix together some materials that maybe you hadn't thought of before. And I can't wait to see what you guys do with this. So with that, this is Josh Mall signing off.